The TV producer looked Sammy Davis Jr. straight in the eye and said the words that should have ended his career before it started. "We don't need your kind here, boy." 3 minutes later, that same man was on his knees, literally begging Sammy to sign the biggest contract in television history. It was March 15th, 1956, and American television was about to change forever. But nobody in NBC's executive boardroom that afternoon had any idea that history was walking through their door in the form of a 5'6" black entertainer who refused to take no for an answer. Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't supposed to be there. In fact, according to NBC's unwritten policies, he couldn't be there. The network had what they called standards and practices, but what everyone in the industry knew was really a color barrier that kept black performers off primetime television. But Sammy had spent his entire life breaking down barriers that weren't supposed to be broken. The meeting had been arranged by his agent, Cy Marsh, who'd been trying for months to get Sammy a television opportunity. Not just any opportunity. He wanted Sammy to be the first black entertainer to host his own primetime variety show. It was an audacious goal in 1956 America, where most black performers were lucky to get a single song on Ed Sullivan before disappearing back into the segregated world of black entertainment. Say, had finally convinced Harold Morrison, NBC's head of programming, to give Sammy a 15-minute meeting, just to hear him out, Morrison had said. But don't get your hopes up. Our audience isn't ready for that. What Morrison didn't tell Cy was that he'd already made up his mind before the meeting even started. The answer was no, and it was going to stay no. Sammy arrived at NBC Studios at Rockefeller Center 30 minutes early. He'd spent the morning getting his hair perfectly styled, his shoes shined to a mirror finish, and his best suit pressed. He knew he would have exactly one chance to make an impression, and that chance would have to overcome not just his lack of television experience, but the color of his skin. The receptionist, a young white woman who clearly wasn't expecting him, looked uncomfortable when he announced himself. "Mr. Davis," she said, checking her appointment book twice. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" "I'm sure," Sammy replied, with a kind of confident smile that had been disarming hostile audiences since he was 7 years old. 20 minutes later, he was sitting in Harold Morrison's corner office on the 30th floor, looking out at Manhattan while Morrison shuffled papers and avoided eye contact. Morrison was a man who'd built his career on being able to spot talent, but he was also a man who'd built his success on knowing his audience. And in 1956, he believed his audience wasn't ready for a black star in their living rooms every week. "Mr. Davis," Morrison began, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone delivering bad news, "I appreciate you coming in today. I really do. But I need to be frank with you about something." Sammy leaned forward, ready to hear the inevitable rejection. He'd heard it before, from club owners, booking agents, and record executives. But he'd also learned that sometimes, if you could just get people to see what you could do, their minds could change faster than they ever thought possible. "The television business is different from the nightclub business," Morrison continued. "Our sponsors have certain expectations. Our viewers have certain comfort levels. And right now, frankly, we don't need your kind here, boy." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Morrison had delivered them casually, almost matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing the weather. But for Sammy, they carried the weight of every indignity, every closed door, every reminder that his talent would always be secondary to his skin color. Most performers would have stood up, thanked Morrison for his time, and left. Most would have accepted that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the odds were so stacked against them. But Sammy Davis Jr. had never been most performers. "Mr. Morrison," Sammy said quietly, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "I understand your concerns. I really do. But before I leave, would you mind if I showed you something?" Morrison looked confused. "Showed me something?" "Mr. Davis, I think I've been clear about our position." "Just 3 minutes, Sammy said, standing up and moving toward the center of the office. 3 minutes of your time, and then I'll walk out of here and never bother you again." Something in Sammy's tone, not pleading, not desperate, but absolutely certain, made Morrison pause. "Mr. Davis, this is my office, not a stage." "I don't think—" 3 minutes, Sammy repeated. "What do you have to lose?" Morrison glanced at his watch, then at his secretary, through the glass wall of his office. A few other executives had gathered in the outer office, curious about the unusual visitor. "Fine," he said with exasperation. 3 minutes. But then this meeting is over. What happened next would be talked about in NBC's executive offices for decades. Sammy didn't need music. He didn't need a stage or lights or an audience. He just needed 3 minutes, and the absolute certainty that his talent was bigger than anyone's prejudice. He started with impressions, first Jimmy Cagney, then Cary Grant, then Gary Cooper. But these weren't just impressions. They were perfect mimicries that captured not just the voices, but the entire personalities of Hollywood's biggest stars. Morrison found himself unconsciously leaning forward, drawn in despite himself. Then Sammy began to sing. He started with "The Way You Look Tonight," his voice transforming from the tough guy Cagney impression to something smooth and sophisticated that would have made Frank Sinatra jealous. But before Morrison could fully process the transition, Sammy shifted again, this time into a gospel-influenced version that showcased the power and range that had been honed in black churches and nightclubs across America. 2 minutes in, Sammy was dancing. Not just moving to the music, but creating a performance that turned Morrison's sterile office into an intimate nightclub. He spun. He slid. He moved with a kind of precision and athleticism that made every gesture look effortless. By the 3rd minute, Harold Morrison had forgotten that he was sitting in his office. He'd forgotten about sponsors and comfort levels and network policies. He was watching something he'd never seen before, a performer so completely in command of his craft that he could transform any space, any audience, any situation. When Sammy finished, with a final note that seemed to hang in the air long after his voice had stopped, the office was completely silent. Morrison sat in his chair, staring at this young man who had just delivered the most compelling 3 minutes of entertainment he'd ever witnessed. His mind was racing, trying to process what he'd just seen and what it meant for everything he thought he knew about television and audiences and star power. "Mr. Davis," Morrison said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't finish the sentence because there weren't words for what he'd just witnessed. In 3 minutes, Sammy had demonstrated not just talent, but the kind of magnetic presence that television had been searching for since its inception. Morrison stood up from his desk and walked around to where Sammy was standing. And then, to Sammy's complete shock, the man who had just told him, "We don't need your kind here," dropped to one knee. "Mr. Davis," Morrison said, looking up at Sammy with something approaching desperation in his eyes, "I need you to forget everything I said when you walked in here. I need you to sit back down and let me tell you about the biggest opportunity in television history." The transformation was so complete, so immediate, that Sammy almost couldn't process it. This was the same man who had dismissed him with racial slurs less than 5 minutes earlier. Now he was literally on his knees, begging for Sammy's attention. "I've been in this business for 20 years, Morrison continued, still kneeling, "and I have never seen anything like what you just did. You could be the biggest star in television history. Not the biggest black star, not the biggest variety star, the biggest star, period." Morrison's secretary and the other executives who had been watching through the glass wall were now pressed against the windows, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Their boss, one of the most powerful men in television, was on his knees in front of a performer he'd been planning to reject. "Get up, Mr. Morrison," Sammy said quietly. "Please." Morrison stood, his face flushed with embarrassment and excitement. "Mr. Davis, I owe you an apology. What I said when you came in here was inexcusable. It was wrong, and it was stupid, and it was the kind of thinking that's going to kill television if we don't change." He walked back to his desk and began pulling out contracts and schedules. "I want to offer you your own variety show. Primetime Friday nights at 8 o'clock. 13 episodes to start, with an option for more, if the ratings justify it. Full creative control, choice of guests, choice of music, everything." Sammy sat back down, trying to absorb what was happening. "Mr. Morrison, 5 minutes ago. You said, 5 minutes ago, I was an idiot." Morrison interrupted. "5 minutes ago I was thinking like a businessman, instead of someone who understands entertainment. What you just showed me, that's not just talent, that's television magic." The contract Morrison was offering wasn't just groundbreaking, it was revolutionary. No black performer had ever been offered their own primetime variety show. Most weren't even allowed to appear as regular guests on existing shows. But Morrison wasn't finished. "In Mr. Davis, I want you to know that this isn't charity. This isn't us trying to be progressive or make a statement. This is pure business. You're going to make this network more money than any performer we've ever had." The show that resulted from that March afternoon meeting was the Sammy Davis Jr. show, which premiered 6 months later and ran for 2 successful seasons. It wasn't just the first primetime variety show hosted by a black performer. It was one of the highest-rated shows on television. But more importantly, it opened doors that had been locked for decades. Other networks began looking for their own black stars. Advertising agencies started recognizing the buying power of black audiences, and performers who had been relegated to segregated venues found themselves with opportunities they never could have imagined. The success wasn't without challenges. Sammy faced death threats, boycotts from racist viewers, and constant pressure from civil rights groups who felt he wasn't political enough. Some Southern stations refused to air the show, and several sponsors initially pulled their support. But Morrison had been right about one thing. Sammy was television magic. His ratings were so strong that sponsors came back, Southern stations changed their policies, and other networks scrambled to find their own breakthrough stars. Years later, Morrison would tell interviewers that those 3 minutes in his office were the most important 3 minutes of his career. "I learned that day that talent doesn't have a color," he would say. "I learned that audiences are smarter than we give them credit for, and that the biggest mistake you can make in television is underestimating what people are ready for." For Sammy, the moment represented something even more significant. It was proof that excellence could overcome prejudice, that talent could break down barriers that legislation couldn't touch, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not with speeches or protests, but with 3 minutes of undeniable artistry. The office where it all happened still exists at NBC's Rockefeller Center headquarters. There's no plaque or marker to commemorate what occurred there in March 1956, but the impact of those 3 minutes can still be felt in every diverse face that appears on television today. Harold Morrison kept a photo on his desk until he retired, not of himself, with celebrities or industry awards, but of the moment Sammy Davis Jr. walked into his office and changed his mind about what American television could be. And Sammy? He kept that rejection letter Morrison had prepared before their meeting. It was found among his personal effects after he died, with a handwritten note attached. "Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is someone telling you that you don't belong. It gives you a chance to prove them wrong." The story of those 3 minutes in Studio 6B reminds us that prejudice is often just fear of the unknown, and that the fastest way to overcome fear is to replace it with undeniable evidence of excellence. It also reminds us that some of the most important moments in history happen not in front of cameras or crowds, but in small rooms where one person decides to take a chance on doing something they've never done before. If this incredible story of courage, talent, and transformation inspired you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to remember that talent has no color and excellence can't be denied. Have you ever had to prove yourself to someone who had already made up their mind about you? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing untold stories about the entertainers who changed America forever.